Jake Miller wanted nothing but peace on his farm, until he caught his HOA neighbor stealing his water. When he fought back, she declared war, but her greed would lead to a fall so humiliating, no one would forget. Jake Miller had always dreamed of owning a piece of land where he could live and work without interference. Years ago, he purchased a 40-acre farm just outside the small town of Redwood Hills, a peaceful rural area in the American Midwest. He wasn't interested in bustling city life or suburban conformity. He wanted to cultivate his own crops, raise livestock, and build something with his own hands. Over the years, he had turned his property into a thriving organic farm, supplying fresh produce and dairy to the local markets. Every morning he woke up before dawn, tending to his fields, checking on the irrigation system, and making sure his livestock were well fed. It was hard work, but it was honest work, and he took pride in every inch of land he called his own. Not far from Jake's farm was the gated community of Silver Lake Estates, an upscale development run by a homeowners association, HOA. The HOA was notorious for its strict rules and suffocating regulations, dictating everything from lawn height to mailbox colors. The residents, mostly wealthy suburbanites, enjoyed their carefully curated environment, and at the helm of it all was Karen Blakewell, the iron-fisted president of the HOA. She was the kind of person who believed that order and uniformity were the pillars of a civilized society. She saw herself not just as a leader, but as a guardian of the community's high standards. Jake, however, had nothing to do with the HOA. His farm predated the development by decades, and his land was legally separate from their jurisdiction. He had no interest in their rules or community politics, and he expected them to leave him alone in return. But the problem was Karen didn't see it that way. Over the past few years, the HOA had expanded its influence beyond its legal boundaries, attempting to exert control over properties that technically weren't part of their association. Jake had ignored their previous letters, demanding that he adhere to their aesthetic guidelines, dismissing them as overreaching nonsense. But he wasn't prepared for what came next. It started with something subtle. One particularly hot summer morning, Jake noticed that his irrigation system was struggling. His water levels were dropping faster than usual. At first, he thought it was a leak. He spent hours inspecting his pipes, checking the reservoir, and ensuring that his well was functioning properly. Everything seemed fine, yet his water reserve continued to drain at an alarming rate. Then, as he walked along the edge of his property, he saw something that made his blood boil. A thick rubber hose, snaking through the barbed wire fence, stretched from his main water supply, straight into the neighboring community. Someone had illegally tapped into his farm's water system. His pulse quickened as he followed the hose, weaving through the dry grass, past the fence line, until he reached the other end. The hose disappeared behind a row of immaculately trimmed hedges that marked the back of a lavish two-story house with a grand patio and a pristine green lawn. Karen Blakewell's house. Jake's fists clenched as the realization sank in. She had been stealing his water. Jake wasted no time. He pulled out his phone and took several photos of the hose running from his water supply to Karen's property. He zoomed in on the connection point, where someone had crudely attached a splitter to his irrigation system, diverting his water for their use. His stomach churned with anger. This wasn't just some petty violation of property lines. This was theft, plain and simple. Without hesitation, he yanked the hose from the splitter, cutting off the illicit supply. Water gushed from the pipe for a moment before settling into a slow trickle, the stolen flow severed. The only thing left to do now was confront the culprit. Marching up to the imposing iron gates of Silver Lake Estates, Jake rang the buzzer outside Karen's house. It took less than a minute for the gates to slide open, as if she had been expecting him. Karen stood on her front porch, wearing an expensive linen dress, a smug smirk curling at the corners of her lips. In one hand, she held an iced tea, condensation dripping down the glass in the relentless summer heat. "Ah, Jake," she said with an almost theatrical sigh. "I assume you're here about the water?" Jake took a step forward, barely containing his anger. "Damn right I am. You hooked up a hose to my system and siphoned my water without my permission." "That's theft, Karen." Karen let out a short laugh, shaking her head as if he had just accused her of something ridiculous. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just water. And really, Jake, we both know that the community's landscaping requires proper irrigation. Your farm is right next to us, and you have plenty to spare." Jake narrowed his eyes. "Plenty to spare? Are you kidding me? Do you even know how hard I work to keep my farm running? That water is for my crops and livestock, not for your manicured lawns." Karen took a sip of her tea, unfazed. "Jake, let's be reasonable. You're not exactly paying into the HOA's infrastructure, yet you benefit from our roads, our security, our community upkeep. Consider this: a fair trade." Jake felt his grip tighten around the severed end of the hose, still in his hand. "A fair trade?" he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "I'm not part of your HOA, Karen. I never was. You don't get to make up rules that apply to me just because it's convenient for you." Karen's expression hardened. The faux politeness drained from her face, replaced by something colder, more calculating. "Jake," she said, setting her glass down, "I don't think you understand how things work around here. Silver Lake Estates is the heart of this area. We set the standard. And frankly, it's not a good look for our community to have a rundown farm sitting right next to us. Perhaps you should consider aligning with our guidelines." Jake scoffed. "So that's what this is really about. You're trying to pressure me into joining the HOA." Karen shrugged, feigning innocence. "It's never too late to do the right thing." Jake took a deep breath, reining in the urge to shout. Instead, he lifted his phone and held up the photos he had taken. "You stole my water. I have proof. Either you pay for what you took, or I take this to the sheriff." Karen's eyes flicked to the phone, then back to Jake. For the first time, her composure faltered, only slightly, but enough for him to notice. Then just as quickly, she recovered. With a patronizing smile, she stepped forward and patted him on the shoulder, as if he were a child. "Oh, Jake," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You can take it to the sheriff if you want. But let's be honest. Who do you think the local authorities will listen to? A respected HOA president who's done so much for this community? Or a stubborn farmer with a grudge?" Jake pulled his shoulder away from her touch. "We'll see about that," he muttered before turning on his heel and walking away. That afternoon, he drove straight to the sheriff's office and filed an official theft report against Karen Blakewell. But he should have known she wouldn't go down that easily. The next morning, he woke up to find a notice from the county pinned to his front gate. An official complaint had been filed against his farm, accusing him of environmental violations related to water usage. Accompanying the notice was a second letter, this one from the HOA itself, demanding that he comply with their water conservation policies that he wasn't even legally subject to. Jake clenched his jaw. This wasn't over. Jake spent the next few days fending off a barrage of bureaucratic attacks. Inspectors from the county showed up at his farm unannounced, combing through his irrigation system, measuring water usage, and citing him for trumped-up violations that had clearly been orchestrated by Karen and her allies in the HOA. The accusations were absurd. Claims that his water usage was excessive, that his unauthorized farm structures disrupted local drainage patterns. It was obvious retaliation. But Jake was prepared. He had documented everything. The stolen water, the illegal connection, Karen's smug confession. He hired a lawyer and fought back, forcing the county to acknowledge that the complaints were baseless. With his legal defenses in place, he thought the worst was over. He was wrong. One evening, after a long day tending to his crops and livestock, Jake sat on his porch, sipping a cold beer and watching the sunset. The summer heat still clung to the air, and the distant hum of crickets filled the silence. As he leaned back in his chair, exhaustion creeping into his muscles, a flicker of movement near his water tanks caught his eye. His breath stilled. A shadowy figure lurked near the pump station, crouched low, fumbling with the main control valve. The dim glow of a flashlight illuminated two figures, one working the pipes, the other standing guard. Jake's stomach clenched. Someone was sabotaging his water supply. He moved quickly. Grabbing his shotgun, he silently slipped around the side of the house, keeping to the shadows. His boots barely made a sound on the dry earth as he crept closer, the dim light revealing more details. One of the intruders was a man, stocky, middle-aged, dressed in work clothes. The other, Karen Blakewell. Jake clenched his jaw. Karen stood nearby, her arms crossed, whispering instructions. The man, a hired contractor no doubt, was tampering with his pipes, wrenching open key valves, likely trying to drain his reserve or damage the system beyond repair. Jake had seen enough. He pumped his shotgun and stepped forward. "That's enough!" The loud click of the weapon echoed in the night. The contractor jumped back, dropping his wrench with a metallic clang. Karen spun around, eyes wide, but quickly masked her fear with that same patronizing smirk. "Well, well, Jake," she said, feigning amusement. "Out for an evening stroll?" Jake's voice was dangerously low. "Step away from my pump." Karen took a slow, deliberate step forward, raising her hands as if she were offended by the accusation. Now, let's not be hasty. We were just inspecting things, making sure everything was up to code." Jake motioned to the wrench, the loosened pipes, the clear act of sabotage. "Yeah? And what code is that? The one where you destroy private property?" The contractor made a move to bolt, but Jake turned the shotgun his way. "Not so fast." Karen's composure cracked. "All right, fine. So maybe I was just leveling the playing field. You embarrassed me, Jake. You humiliated me in front of my community. Did you really think I'd let you get away with that?" Jake took a slow step closer, towering over her. "You stole my water. Then you tried to ruin my farm. And now you're trespassing and committing vandalism. That's jail time, Karen." She scoffed, but her bravado faltered. "Oh, please, you wouldn't dare." Jake smirked. "Lucky for you, I don't have to." Before Karen could react, the distant wail of police sirens shattered the silence. Jake had already called the sheriff the moment he spotted movement near the pump. Karen's face drained of color. She turned to her accomplice, hissing, "Run!" But it was too late. As flashing red and blue lights illuminated the farm, Karen made a desperate move to flee, only to misjudge her footing. With a sharp yelp, she stumbled backward, straight into the manure pit. There was a sickening squelch as she plunged waist-deep into the thick, sludgy muck, the overwhelming stench instantly coating her. She flailed, spluttering, trying to scramble out, but the more she moved, the deeper she sank. The contractor abandoned her immediately, sprinting toward the fence just as the police vehicles skidded to a halt. Officers jumped out, flashlights swinging across the property. One of them, Deputy Rodriguez, approached Jake, taking in the scene, the wrecked pipes, the stolen water supply, and The HOA president stuck in a pit of manure. Jake sighed and slung his shotgun over his shoulder. You might want to call for backup. It looks like someone just dug herself into a deep pile of trouble. Karen's furious shrieks pierced the night as she thrashed in the manure pit, her designer dress clinging to her body in a filthy, reeking mess. The once pristine HOA president was now an unrecognizable, mud-covered disaster. Her platinum blonde hair streaked with brown, her manicured hands clawing at the edges of the pit in a desperate but futile attempt to escape. Deputy Rodriguez and the other officers exchanged looks, trying and failing to suppress their amusement. The other trespasser, the contractor, was already handcuffed and shoved into a squad car, his face pale as he muttered about how he had just been hired for a simple plumbing job and had no idea things would go this far. Karen, however, was a different story. "Get me out of here!" she bellowed, her voice cracking with rage and embarrassment. "I demand that you arrest him." She jabbed a dripping, manure-covered finger at Jake. "He assaulted us. He's violating HOA regulations. This is all his fault." Deputy Rodriguez sighed, stepping forward as he pulled out a notepad. "Karen Blakewell, you're trespassing on private property, and we have clear evidence of vandalism and attempted sabotage. We also have a formal complaint from Mr. Miller regarding the theft of his water. I'd suggest you stay quiet and start thinking about your legal defense." Karen's eyes widened in shock. "You can't do this. I'm the HOA president. This is a mistake." Rodriguez glanced over at Jake, who stood calmly with his arms crossed, watching Karen wallow in her own self-inflicted humiliation. With a smirk, he stepped closer to the pit, crouching down just enough to meet her eyes. "Looks like the only mistake here," Jake said, his voice dripping with satisfaction, "was thinking you could get away with this." The officers threw a rope ladder into the pit, but Karen's movements were slow and clumsy in the thick, disgusting sludge. As she dragged herself up, each motion sent foul-smelling gunk dripping onto the ground, creating a growing puddle of shame around her feet. But the worst part wasn't the stench. It was the cameras. Several neighbors from Silver Lake Estates had arrived, drawn by the flashing police lights. Some had their phones out, recording every second. Karen, once the unyielding dictator of the HOA, was now nothing more than a meme waiting to happen. "Damn," one of the residents muttered, chuckling as they filmed. "Guess she's not so high and mighty anymore." "Serves her right," another neighbor said. "She's been terrorizing this place for years." Karen's lips trembled with fury. "Stop recording this!" she screeched, but her words only emboldened them. The camera zoomed in, capturing every dripping, seething, foul-smelling second of her absolute disgrace. One officer opened the door of the squad car. "Ma'am, I suggest you get in before you embarrass yourself any further." Karen hesitated, looking at the vehicle's pristine interior, then at herself. The reality dawned on her. She was about to ruin a police car with her own filth, but there was no other option. She groaned in defeat, climbed inside, and the squad car door slammed shut. Jake let out a breath, watching as the car pulled away, taking Karen off into the night. He turned back toward his property, his water supply still intact, his farm still standing. But the battle wasn't over yet. Karen might be publicly humiliated, but there were still consequences to settle, and Jake was going to make sure she paid for every last bit of damage she had caused. The fallout from Karen's spectacular downfall spread through Silver Lake Estates like wildfire. Within hours, the footage of her manure-soaked humiliation was uploaded to social media, racking up thousands of views overnight. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting the tale of the HOA president who tried to sabotage a local farmer and ended up covered in filth. The comments were merciless. By morning, her reign was over. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal. The residents, already frustrated by years of Karen's overreach, turned on her completely. The very people who had once feared her now mocked her. She always acted like she was above everyone else, one resident scoffed. Guess now she knows what it feels like to be down in the dirt. In a landslide vote, Karen was removed as president. The board, realizing that the entire HOA was now a laughingstock, scrambled to salvage what was left. But it was too late. Karen's downfall ignited something within the community. Homeowners started questioning everything. Why were their fees so high? Why did they allow one woman so much power? Lawsuits started piling up. Residents began challenging old fines and demanding refunds for the thousands of dollars they had paid over the years in arbitrary violations. Some even pushed for the complete dissolution of the HOA, arguing that it had done more harm than good. Meanwhile, Jake made sure that Karen paid for what she had done. His lawsuit for damages moved forward swiftly, with video evidence of her trespassing, theft, and vandalism ensuring an easy, legal victory. The court ordered full restitution for every penny of water stolen and every inch of damage done to his property. Karen, once the queen of the neighborhood, was financially ruined. With legal fees piling up and no allies left, she did the only thing she could. She sold her house and disappeared. By the time the dust settled, Silver Lake Estates had changed forever. The HOA, once feared, was now weak and struggling to survive. And Jake? Jake was still standing, his farm untouched, his water supply secure, and his independence stronger than ever. Months had passed since Karen's downfall, but the impact of her disgrace still echoed through Silver Lake Estates and the surrounding town. The once feared HOA was now a shell of its former self, barely able to enforce its own remaining rules. Homeowners, once too afraid to push back, had banded together, voting to strip the association of most of its powers. The HOA's iron grip had been broken, and Jake's victory had set a precedent. Sitting on his porch, Jake looked out over his land. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows over his thriving crops. His water system, now more secure than ever, glistened in the fading light. Despite all the chaos, his farm had endured. A familiar pickup truck pulled up his driveway, kicking up dust as it rolled to a stop. Stepping out was Deputy Rodriguez, his hat tilted slightly, his usual sharp eyes filled with something Jake rarely saw from law enforcement when it came to HOA disputes: respect. "Thought I'd stop by," Rodriguez said, leaning against the porch railing. "Town's still talking about what happened. They're calling it the Great HOA Reckoning." Jake chuckled, taking a sip of his coffee. "Not exactly how I expected to make headlines, but I'll take it." Rodriguez smirked. "That HOA of theirs is hanging by a thread. Lawsuits, investigations, and a whole lot of angry homeowners. I hear some folks are pushing to dissolve it completely." Jake nodded. "They should. Nobody should have to deal with people like Karen deciding how they live." Rodriguez sighed, adjusting his belt. "Speaking of Karen, she's gone, sold her house, skipped town. Word is, she tried to get into another HOA board in a new community, but..." He chuckled. "Turns out, her reputation followed her. Nobody wants her anywhere near their neighborhood." Jake shook his head. Poetic justice. A comfortable silence settled between them before Rodriguez spoke again, more serious this time. "You know, you did something important here, Jake. A lot of people let HOAs push them around because they don't think they can fight back. But you did. And you won." Jake leaned back in his chair, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the horizon. He hadn't set out to be a symbol of defiance, but that's what he had become. He had stood his ground, fought for what was his, and proved that even the most overreaching HOA wasn't above the law. "People have rights," he finally said. "Sometimes you just have to remind them." As Rodriguez tipped his hat and drove off, Jake sat there a little longer, listening to the quiet hum of his land, the land he fought for and would always protect.